evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lorenzo Butler. I'm in our Public Affairs Department here at the Kansas City Public Library. It's good to have you all out tonight for this amazing discussion that we're about to have. So just wanted to welcome you all for coming, and if you can, please pick up a calendar for October, and it's just right outside here. You can see some of the great events that we have coming up here at the library. So I have been up since I think about 4:30 this morning, preparing for today. We were scheduled to have Ms. Gianturco on KCTV 5 for the morning show this morning, but there was breaking news, and it's just been a crazy morning. But she stuck with us, so I appreciate her patience on that. I was talking to people, though, at KCTV 5, some of the reporters and the producers, and I told them, I said, you know, we've had a lot of great books that have come to the library in 2012, but I think for me personally, this one is very special. When you think about grandmothers, all of us, for the most part, have dealt with a grandmother or have had a close relationship with a grandmother. Some of us are grandmothers, not me, but some of us are. But to say that, as I was going through the book, I was thinking about my grandmothers. I have one who died in 2003, but she died of cancer in 2003, but her name was Dorothy Faye Butler. She was a teenage mother. She had her first child at 16, had her second child at 18, and then moved up to Kansas City, Missouri to start a career and try to take care of her children. She helped them get through some trying times here as a single black mother, you know, trying to raise them through the Martin Luther King riots and tragedies of that nature, hoping that they would do the best that they could going forward in life. Also had another grandmother whose name is Sue Williams, and she had 11 children, and we lost count of the grandchildren around 50, so big difference there. But their families were different as far as size is concerned, but the love and the passion that they had for everyone in their family left a big mark and made them close friends until one of them passed away. I say that because it impressed me that Ms. Gianturco would take 4.5 years of her life to, you know, research grandmothers from around the world and to get their stories and to understand who they are. And when you see the book, when you purchase the book at the end of the event, you will see many different faces. You'll see many smiles. You'll see a lot of happiness. The color schemes and the skin are different, but the love is the same. And that is something that's very impressive to me. And I'm sure it was to her as she put this book together. So whether it's Ingi Gold, who's a grandmother of 3, or Winifred Mangshalana, who's a grandmother of 13, I know me personally, I saw the eyes of Sue Williams and Dorothy Faye Butler when I went through this book, and I think you all will see the grandmothers that were important in your life as well. One more great thing about this book is that 100% of the author royalties will go to the Grandmother to Grandmother campaign, the Stephen Lewis Foundation in Toronto. So she is putting her money where her heart is, and we're looking forward to this presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to present to you Paola Gianturco.
All over the world, grandmothers are creating a better life for their grandchildren and your grandchildren and mine. I first began meeting activist grandmothers when I was in Kenya. And I was working, and as I often do when I'm starting conversations with the women whom I interview, I said, "Tell me how many children you have." And the first woman said, "I have 2 and 8 adopted." And the second woman said, "I have 3 and 15 adopted." And the third woman said, "I have 4 and 12 adopted." Suddenly, I realized that what they were really telling me was that they were raising their grandchildren because their children had died of AIDS. I met grandmothers all over the continent that trip, which was in 2006, who were raising their grandchildren for that very same reason. And I left thinking, my God, the future of this continent literally rests in the hands of the grandmothers. So I was inspired to begin looking at grandmothers other places to see what they were doing. And immediately I found grandmother groups, activist grandmother groups in 33 countries, literally all over the world. I realized that there was an unheralded new women's movement. Activist grandmothers. Some of you are nodding. Some of you knew this. I had no idea this was the case at that point. And I decided to meet them and to focus this project on them. I interviewed and photographed 120 grandmothers in 17 activist grandmother groups in 15 countries on 5 continents. They invited me into their homes. They introduced me to their grandchildren. We talked about what their projects were, what they were working on. In India, the women dressed me up in their sari. I think they didn't think I was colorful enough. I don't know why they would think that. In Senegal and in the Philippines, we danced together. I met these women as my sisters, because I'm a grandmother too. And I finished the project. They were my heroes. So one of the things I would like to do tonight is introduce you to my heroes, starting with the grandmothers in India who are bringing light to their dark villages. One in every 5 people in the world lives without electricity. 200 illiterate grandmothers learned how to be solar engineers at the Barefoot College in Rajasthan. And when they brought electricity to their villages, everything changed. The midwives could deliver babies in the middle of the night. The children could study without getting black lung disease from studying by kerosene lanterns. It was safe to walk outside in the dark. Those grandmothers returned to the Barefoot College to teach more Indian grandmothers how to become solar engineers. Their work was so effective that the United Nations began sending them grandmothers from other places. I was there when 20 grandmothers from Africa, 2 each from 10 countries, arrived to study with the Indian grandmothers. None of them had ever been on an airplane. None of them, in fact, had ever been to school. Because the Indian grandmothers didn't speak the same languages that the African grandmothers did, they taught by gesture, and they taught by color coding, and they taught by experimentation and diagrams and demonstrations. Grandmother solar engineers have now brought electricity to 10,000 households in India and to 35,000 households in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. Solar electricity now charges cell phones, which they didn't used to have. They can now do electronic banking, and it charges refrigerators, which they also didn't used to have. The solar grandmothers are viewed as VIPs. They go back to their villages, and the head of the Barefoot College told me they return to their villages as tigers. Grandmothers end female genital mutilation in Senegal. Grandmothers are the authorities on family health in many cultures. An NGO, which is called the Grandmother Project, discovered that when grandmothers get sometimes even just one bit of contemporary medical information, children's health can improve dramatically and almost instantly. When grandmothers in Senegal learned from health workers that their daughters were dying in childbirth from hemorrhaging as a result of female genital mutilation, they were shocked. They organized immediately to stop FGM, which they had not only championed but in fact conducted. They sought help from the imams. They talked to school principals. They talked with head men in their villages, And then they convened village meetings of old and young and men and women to discuss the subject. They were very smart about those discussions. They started by asking the villagers to identify good traditions. And they said, tell us good traditions that should be continued. The list included traditional dances, stories, songs, riddles, proverbs, and games. Only later did the grandmothers ask their communities to define, quote, bad traditions, which should be abandoned. Ultimately, all 20 villages came to the same conclusion as soon as the health workers, at the grandmothers' requests, came and shared the same information they had before. All 20 villages came to the same conclusion that FGM should be stopped. They also decided to stop teen marriage and early pregnancy. And today, grandmothers are teaching high school classes about those subjects. This woman, whose name is Hawa Balde, told me before we were like animals in the forest together, but not working together. And Dado Balde told me, if I told you the importance of grandmothers now in the house, in the community, in the education of children, it would take all morning. Grandmothers are fighting child obesity in Ireland. Convenience foods, frozen foods, preservatives, chemicals leach nutrition from foods. There's just plain nothing as healthy as eating homegrown, home-cooked food. Darina Allen, she's been called the Julia Child of Ireland, and her friend, Alice Waters, the California chef, worry about obese children. Darina told me it's not their fault. Cooking skills have been lost. So Darina and Alice invented International Slow Food Grandmother's Day. It happens at the end of April every year. And the grandmothers teach the grandchildren on that day to plant and cook and enjoy fresh, homegrown food. So the slow food movement all over the world now celebrates this holiday, and you can too. I documented the Grandmother's Day in Ireland, starting in Ballymaloe, Cork. There, Darina's grandchildren and some friends were baking scones for a tea party. I love this picture. Do you remember when your grandchildren ate like this? This is sort of the blissful mess stage. After lunch in Waterford, grandmothers and grandchildren planted food, vegetables in an edible garden, and that garden will produce peas and cabbages come summer. I ended the day in Dublin with Monica Murphy and Meg Wood. This is Meg and one of their grandchildren. Seven of their granddaughters were cooking dinner for them. I will tell you something, if I could cook as well as these little girls, I would be delirious. My husband would be delirious. Meg's granddaughter proved that a missing tooth is not enough to stop you from gobbling up a cupcake. Grandmothers are tackling child abuse in Guatemala. There is a village in Guatemala, the grandmothers whom I interviewed in Jalapa told me. There is a village in Guatemala where fathers expect to be their daughters' first sexual partners. The grandmothers not only report those men to the police, they are teaching good parenting practices, and they are staffing Plan International's Child Abuse Hotline. It's the grandmothers who have the time to listen to the stories of the assaults and the compassion to comfort the callers and the wisdom to make appropriate referrals. A social worker told me neighbors and children and parents all prefer to talk about child abuse with an understanding, warm, friendly, nice grandmother. This grandmother agreed with her. She said, "We are soft, like avocados." Natividad, who is 80, isn't soft. When one father came after her with his machete, she stood her ground. She said, "I had been trained. I wasn't afraid." I accompanied these grandmothers to villages where they used games to teach that good parenting includes hugs and smiles and talking and listening. Several grandmothers who do this work told me that they had themselves experienced domestic violence. Gloria de Palma, whose husband beat her, told me, even if someone kills me for reporting child abuse, I will do it. Grandmothers battle against human rights abuse in Israel. Every day, 70 to 100,000 Palestinians pass through the military checkpoints to get to school, to get to doctors, to get to jobs. When they get to the booths where the soldiers check their identity cards and permits, they may be detained 4 hours without any explanation. I don't know of an army in the world that isn't trained to maintain control and power. This kind of delay, is one way. Israeli grandmothers simply found that unacceptable. Between 2000 and 2006, 68 Palestinian women gave birth at the checkpoints, 35 of whom miscarried and 5 of whom died. Between 2001 and 2004, 991 Palestinians were denied medical access. 83 died at the checkpoints. 2 by 2, Israeli Jewish grandmothers have monitored the checkpoints all over the West Bank since 2002. They document farmers' products that are rotting at the checkpoints because they can't get them to market. They document bridegrooms who can't get to their own weddings, students who are missing their final exams. The grandmothers issue daily reports of abuse to the journalists, to the Knesset, and on the internet. They've actually won grudging respect from the Israel Defense Forces, whose spokesman told the media, "We have found there are things we can make better." IDF soldiers are now trained to use respectful behavior when dealing with Palestinians. Some checkpoints now have hotlines for humanitarian assistance. They have drinking water and bathrooms and shade and areas where Muslims can spread their prayer rugs. The grandmothers are part of an organization called Maxim Watch, which means Checkpoint Watch. Like observant Jews everywhere, they teach their grandchildren to fight prejudice and injustice and to treat others as they would want to be treated. Hannah Barag took me to checkpoints all over the West Bank. The work that these grandmothers do is courageous and very controversial. Soldiers in their own families don't support it. But these Israeli grandmothers have won the highest award given by the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. Grandmothers are working against illiteracy in Argentina. Even in a world where we all may read with Kindles and iPads, there are still children who can't read. And that's especially true in Argentina, where between the years of 1976 and 1983, the military dictatorship burned books, looted libraries, bombed newspaper offices, killed authors and journalists and intellectuals. As a consequence, people all over Argentina, which had the highest literacy rate in South America, stopped reading. Years later, hoping to re-engage children with books, the Mempo Giardinelli Foundation asked grandmothers to read to the children. The grandmothers did remember how to read. The grandmothers have inspired so many to go to school and to learn to read and to love books that the Storytelling Grandmother program has now been adopted by the Ministry of Education in Argentina and incorporated, and has been copied by 7 other countries, including Spain. Today, the Storytelling Grandmothers program in Argentina includes 2,000 volunteer grandmothers, each assigned to a classroom where they go every week. And what they have learned is that the combination of unconditional love offered by the grandmothers and a love of good reading, good books, and good literature just propels the children's interest in reading and love of books. Silvia De Vici, who is here in black, told me, when I retired, I ask, what will I do with my diplomas and my experience? Where will they go? Into a box? This work, she said, has opened new worlds. Another grandmother, Alicia Assain, reflected on the children's reactions to the grandmother's stories. Oh, let's stay with her for a minute. She said the shine in their eyes, their smiles, their joy about books, those things fill my soul. Reading is an act of love, she said. Reading is a party. Grandmothers fight for justice in the Philippines. During World War II, this church in Manila was a brothel. The Japanese army kidnapped an adolescent girl to provide sex to every 100 soldiers. 30 garrisons in the Philippine Islands doubled as comfort stations. Sex slaves were imprisoned there between 1942 and 45 and forced to serve as many as 10 men a night. For 50 years, the comfort women hid their shameful histories. They hid it even from their own husbands and children. And then a woman named Maria Rosa Henson went on television and told her story and invited other grandmothers now to join her to fight for their rights. The grandmothers, who are called Lolas in Tagalog, transformed their shame into political action. In 1993, they filed a class action suit against the Japanese government, and they asked for reparations and a formal apology and a place in the history books so that their experience would never be repeated. After 10 years, in 2003, Japan's Supreme Court rejected the case. The Lolas didn't give up. They're now mostly in their 80s and 90s. They demonstrate in the street. They speak at universities. They collect signatures on petitions. And sometimes they dance in their bungalow in the afternoons to relax. Their bungalow, by the way, was purchased for them by Japanese citizens who were sympathetic to their cause. Their fight won't end when they die. They are building international support to keep girls and women everywhere safe from sexual violence. Narcissa told me it's crucial. The whole world must fight for the next generation. Grandmothers are fighting against environmental degradation in Thailand. When Thongbai Pongtawang works at her loom, she looks out at a beautiful mountain, and she knows that on the other side of that mountain, a mining company is excavating for gold. Rivers, as a result, are contaminated with dangerous levels of cadmium, arsenic, lead, and manganese. When locals took blood tests, 63% of the samples had arsenic in them, and 100% of the samples had mercury and lead. Thongabai's grandmother group, they are weavers who grow and spin and dye and weave with organic cotton, voted to give 10% of their profits to the neighboring villagers who had now had to buy food and water, which they had never done before. They also wrote to the government and traveled from Loei province in the northeastern part of Thailand to Bangkok, where they talked with officials. And I thought it was an interesting way to approach this issue. They cited the Constitution, and they cited what seemed to me to be uniquely Buddhist arguments. For example, they talked about morality and compassion and the interconnectedness of the officials with their constituents. I just heard that the Thai government has rejected the request to renew the gold company's lease. I hope that's true. I don't know. I hope that's true. And I hope that children like these will continue to live for a long time and wear the jackets that their grandmothers make for them out of organic cotton. Grandmothers rage against political disaffection in the United States. Are there any grandmothers here who are raging grannies? Yes? Officially or unofficially? A complacent public results in a flaccid democracy, we know that. That's why the raging grannies don flowery hats and dowdy aprons and write witty songs and stage playful protests, all to earn media attention and gain awareness of the political issues that they believe will be good or bad for their grandchildren. There's some 60 granny gaggles in 5 countries. I documented the San Francisco Bay Area Raging Granny Action League. Granny Gail writes their lyrics. She told me, "We're there to tell you what you need to know about the issues in a form you will enjoy and potentially remember." Gail continues to agitate even though she's had 2 hip replacements and rides around on her disability scooter. This is Ruth Robertson. She has a collection of aprons in her upstairs hall and a collection of frumpy hats in her dining room cabinets. She tells potential group members, you can mouth the words if you're tone deaf. You don't even have to be a grandmother. You just have to be a woman who's willing to wear a funny hat. All over the world, when I mentioned grandchildren, grandmothers told me stories. Barbara Baxter Berman told me that her 10-year-old granddaughter is a shining, bright, shining girl, she said. And when she comes to visit, they climb up on top of her cottage and rake the leaves and pick persimmons. I thought raging grannies may rage, but they have big hearts. Indigenous grandmothers pray for the earth and for peace. The world seems to be exploding with violence and environmental problems, but an optimistic shared prophecy connects many indigenous groups. It promises that women from the 4 directions will awaken the world. Now the International Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers, they come from Africa, from Nepal, from the United States, from Canada, hold public meetings every 6 months where each one conducts a ceremony according to her own traditions. I interviewed and photographed them in Sedona, Arizona. Jyoti, who first convened them in 2004, told me the grandmothers are challenging us to open our hearts with compassion and acceptance and love and hope and charity. The 13 indigenous grandmothers have prayed at St. Peter's in Rome. They've had an audience with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, India. They've helped get water issues on the United Nations agenda, and they've preserved sacred rights around the world. Their commitment statement says, "We believe that the teaching of our ancestors will light our way to an uncertain future." Grandmothers are demanding justice in Argentina. Military officers tortured and murdered some 30,000 people during the military dictatorship that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And then they stole their victims, infants and toddlers, whom they considered to be educable. Ever since, the children's grandmothers have searched for them, pretending to be maids, pretending to be renters just to get inside the houses where they'd been told their grandchildren might be. They would sit in the park pretending to knit, whereas in fact they were planning their next moves. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo commissioned a geneticist, a US geneticist now working in Washington state, to develop the equivalent of a paternity test. It turns out it's possible. There is a blood tracer between grandmothers and grandchildren. And in fact, Elsa de Aguilar's granddaughter, Paola Logares, was the first grandchild who was identified by genetic testing. 104 others have followed. Between 400 and 500 children were abducted. The grandmother's search in Argentina continues. Grandmothers recapture traditions in Peru. In many cultures, it's the grandmothers who maintain traditions. In Peru, they saved one. Traditional Inca weaving and patterns and dyeing processes had been lost. Woven artifacts had vanished. No one was wearing traditional clothing any longer. The ancestors had been betrayed. Nilda Calanyapa founded the Center for Traditional Textiles of Cusco. Have any of you been to Peru? Have you been to the Center for Traditional Textiles? Yes. It's a remarkable place. Nilda told me that only the grandmothers knew the vocabulary and the meaning of the patterns and the technical information about dyes and looms. She arranged for a local high school to give academic credit to students who interviewed their grandmothers about their grandmothers and their weaving. And little by little, Nilda and the grandmothers collected enough information that they could begin teaching traditional weaving again. Today, people in the Sacred Valley of the Incas can now wear their traditional clothing again with great pride. It's the moral equivalent of Black is beautiful, as it was in the 60s or 70s here. They have suddenly the sense of roots and history and pride again, which they had lost. My last three stories are all about the Stephen Lewis Foundation Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign, which you heard Lorenzo mention. They are helping African grandmothers who are caring for children who are who have been orphaned by AIDS in 15 countries all over the African continent. 100% of my author royalties from this project will go to the Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign to benefit those African grandmothers whom I told you I had first met in Kenya. The foundation now coordinates the work of 245 Canadian grandmother groups all over the country. In the past 6 years, they have raised some $16.5 million, which has provided a continuous flow of small cash infusions directly to the grandmothers in Africa. To represent the 8,000 Stephen Lewis Canadian grandmothers, I photographed the Grandmothers to Grand and Grand Others in Barrie, Ontario. These women will do almost anything to raise money. They will cater parties, yes. They will cater weddings, yes. They will sell ice cream at the beach. The week I was there, the Barrie group was making crafts for a holiday gift fair. They were making teddy bears and dolls and sweaters and art and wreaths. They set up their booth, and it was swamped. Just watch. When they counted the money, it exceeded their wildest dreams, so they did a gratitude dance. Can you do the gratitude dance? It's on YouTube. You can learn it. I am practicing. They are grateful for more than money. Joanne O'Shea, who is here in the red jacket, sent me off with these words. When you meet the grandmothers in Swaziland and South Africa, tell them what a gift they are to us. For us, every day is Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. Grandmothers raising children orphaned by AIDS in Swaziland. 25% of the people, a quarter of the population in Swaziland has HIV/AIDS. It's the highest rate in the world. Rates for some specific population demographics are shockingly higher. For example, pregnant women, 42%. Women 25 to 29, 50%. When Sipiwe Shalope, who was 40, she learned that she was HIV positive. She had not been with another man. Her husband had not been tested, never mind. It was she who was subject to profound discrimination. Sipiwe launched Swaziland for Positive Living for women who are living with the illness and for grandmothers who are caring for children orphaned by AIDS. SWAPOL, for short, now has 9,500 members and is a Stephen Lewis Foundation partner. Zauda chairs the SWAPOL Grandmother Seedling Project. These sprouts will ultimately produce beets and peppers and spinach and cabbage and onions and tomatoes. Margaret chairs a Grandmother's Community Garden, a project that provides both nutrition and income for the grandmothers and for their orphaned grandchildren. Splelele, who is in red, chairs a Grandmother's Peanut Butter project. Grandmothers roast and grind the peanuts and sell jars to local customers. These HIV-positive grandmothers greet each other with an emphatic, "Good morning, how are you?" And then they wait to hear the answer because the answer is important. Finally, grandmothers in South Africa. Although Swaziland has the highest rate of AIDS, South Africa has the largest number of people who have HIV/AIDS, 5.6 million. Grandmothers Against Poverty and AIDS, GAPA for short, is an NGO in Kailicha, outside of Cape Town, where gangs and crime are rampant. GAPA, which is a Stephen Lewis Foundation partner, is run by grandmothers for grandmothers. 80% of all of the grandmothers care for children who've been orphaned by AIDS, 30% care for another relative who has AIDS, and 15% are HIV positive themselves. It made me so sad to think about these women's lives that when I asked the first grandmother, "How are you doing?" the last thing in the world I expected her to say was, "I am strong." I will tell you something. These grandmothers can help each other more than any outsider could ever help them. GAPA Grandmothers started an after-school program. It's the only one in Kailicha. School gets out at 1 p.m. and 135 children immediately run in for lunch, which they have cooked. Children climb all over the playground equipment, purchased with money that came from Canada, I suspect, laughing and shouting. The grandmothers teach each other craft skills so that they can earn money to feed the children. Rita, who learned to make hats, told me, "Hats were the end of poverty in my house. People call me Hats Mama." There is bread in the house. There are eggs in the house. I've got something in my purse. I've got power. Which brings me to the subject of grandmother power. You want one of these? I can tell you how. I have grandmother power, you have grandmother power, and grandother power. I've done a lot of work to find out where it comes from, and I'll share what I know. Today, there are more grandmothers in the world than there have ever been in the history of the world. They are younger than they have ever been. They are better educated than they have ever been. In some countries, depending on the economic situation, they are better off than they have been. In the Northern Hemisphere, they tend to have work experience more than they have had in the past. Thanks to the boomers who came of age during the 1960s, these grandmothers are confident that they can change the world because they did. And all of those things in the aggregate make very effective and energetic grandmothers. They are changing the world, as you've seen. But this is not really only about changing the world. As they are doing this work, I discovered that grandmothers are modeling behaviors that I, for one, think are important values and behaviors. They are teaching, for example, collaboration and generosity and patience and perseverance and resilience. So they are also changing the world. The project website for this book is www.globalgrandmotherpower. If you want to learn more about these groups, or even contact these groups, or support them, or join them, there is a section on the website that says Show Your Power, which includes a list of more than 70 organizations in 33 countries, so that you can start or join or support a group if you are so inclined. I hope you will. I am convinced down to my shoe tops that it will take all of us, grandmothers and grandothers, working together to create hope and possibility for this world. So I thank you for inviting me here. I applaud you for the work you're doing yourselves. So you've done. Thank you all. It is a pleasure to be here with you.